September 2nd, 1945. Sugamo Prison, Tokyo. Corporal Takeshi Yamamoto stood in the entrance of what had been a Japanese military prison, watching as American medics carried stretchers through gates that now opened inward instead of out. The men on those stretchers were Japanese soldiers, starving, diseased, defeated, being transported not to execution grounds, but to hospital wards being established in buildings where interrogations had once occurred. Yamamoto held a clipboard against his chest, the pages covered with names he'd been ordered to record, but his hands were shaking too badly to write. An American medical officer passed him carrying a box marked with red crosses, the cardboard so clean it seemed to glow in the morning light. The officer nodded politely, a gesture of acknowledgement between human beings rather than conqueror and conquered. Yamamoto bowed reflexively, then watched as the American disappeared into what had been the prison's punishment block, now being converted into a surgical theatre. Through the open doorway, he could see Japanese prisoners receiving injections, their skeletal arms extended while medics worked with calm efficiency, speaking softly in accented Japanese, explaining procedures as if these wretched men retained dignity worth respecting. Nothing in Yamamoto's training had prepared him for this. He had been told that capture meant death, that Americans would torture prisoners, that surrender was the ultimate dishonour that could only be expiated through eventual execution. Instead, he witnessed something more disorienting than cruelty: systematic kindness, organised compassion, medical care administered without apparent hatred or vengeance. The Americans were healing their enemies. The morning air carried the smell of disinfectant, a sharp chemical odour that was replacing the stench of human misery that had permeated the prison for years. Yamamoto had worked here since 1943, a clerk assigned to maintain records of prisoners and disciplinary actions. He had documented interrogations, recorded punishments, filed reports about prisoners who had died from disease or malnutrition or beatings. The work had been administrative, kept at emotional distance through paperwork and procedure. But he had known what happened in these buildings, had heard the sounds that came from interrogation rooms, had seen bodies carried out wrapped in canvas. Now American engineers were installing plumbing systems to provide running water. Medical corpsmen were distributing clean clothing to prisoners who had worn rags for months or years. Kitchen staff were preparing food in quantities calculated not to maximize fear, but to restore health gradually, without shocking systems adapted to starvation. The transformation was occurring with speed and efficiency that seemed almost miraculous. Within days, buildings that had been sites of suffering were becoming facilities for healing. The context that made this moment significant extended far beyond one prison in Tokyo. The Japanese military had waged war under doctrines that treated enemy prisoners as beneath contempt, as men who had forfeited honour and humanity through the act of surrender. Japanese prisoner of war camps throughout Asia had been sites of systematic brutality, where captured Allied soldiers died in vast numbers from starvation, disease, forced labour, and deliberate cruelty. The treatment of prisoners had not been aberrational, but doctrinal. Surrender was dishonourable. Prisoners were less than human, and their suffering was consequence of their moral failure. This ideology had been inculcated through every level of Japanese military training. Soldiers were taught that death was preferable to capture, that surrender brought eternal shame to themselves and their families, that enemy prisoners deserved no consideration under any moral or legal framework. The concept of prisoners' rights, formalized in the Geneva Conventions, was dismissed as Western sentimentality inappropriate for the harsh realities of total war. Japanese military leadership had deliberately refused to apply convention protections to captured enemies, creating conditions in camps that guaranteed catastrophic mortality. The statistics documented crimes of staggering scale. Of approximately 132,000 Allied prisoners held by Japan during the war, roughly 27% died in captivity, a mortality rate more than 7 times higher than that of Allied prisoners held by Germany. In some camps and labour details, mortality exceeded 50%. Men died from starvation on rations calculated to provide fewer than 1,000 calories daily. They died from diseases that minimal medical care could have prevented or treated. They died from beatings and executions for trivial infractions or no infractions at all. They died constructing railways and airfields and fortifications, worked literally to death while their Japanese captors viewed their suffering with indifference or satisfaction. Corporal Yamamoto had not worked in those camps, had not directly participated in the atrocities that had occurred throughout the co-prosperity sphere. But he had been part of the system, had maintained records within a military structure that treated prisoners as disposable resources. He had accepted without question the doctrine that enemy captives deserved whatever treatment their captors chose to inflict. The ideology had seemed natural, aligned with everything he had been taught about honor, duty, and the fundamental superiority of Japanese martial values. Now that ideology confronted its antithesis. The Americans were not torturing their prisoners, they were healing them. Yamamoto had expected execution. When Japan surrendered and American forces occupied Tokyo, he had assumed that retribution would be swift and comprehensive. The victors would naturally treat the defeated as the defeated had treated others, with cruelty proportional to the power differential. This was the logic of warfare as he understood it, the natural order of military conflict. Winners destroyed losers, conquerors humiliated the conquered. The strong imposed their will upon the weak without restraint or mercy. Instead, the Americans had arrived with medical supplies, engineering equipment, and organizational directives focused on immediate humanitarian relief. They had begun treating wounded and sick Japanese soldiers and civilians before addressing their own logistical needs. They had established feeding programs to address malnutrition, medical screenings to identify disease, sanitation systems to prevent epidemic. The occupation was being conducted according to principles that prioritized human welfare over vengeance, that treated even defeated enemies as human beings with rights and dignity. The medical care was particularly incomprehensible to Yamamoto's trained worldview. American military doctors and corpsmen were working extended hours to treat Japanese prisoners, using supplies transported from the United States specifically for this purpose. They were diagnosing diseases, performing surgeries, providing medications that were scarce even in American civilian hospitals. The care was not perfunctory or minimal but comprehensive, aimed not just at preventing death but at restoring health, treating chronic conditions, addressing psychological trauma. One prisoner Yamamoto processed that morning was a former sergeant named Tanaka, captured during fighting on Okinawa. Tanaka had lost his left leg below the knee to an American artillery shell and had expected to die from infection in whatever prisoner facility the Americans established. Instead, he had been evacuated to a field hospital where surgeons had cleaned and closed the wound properly. He had received antibiotics to prevent infection, pain medication to manage suffering, and a prosthetic consultation to discuss future mobility aids. Now, 3 months after capture, he was being transferred to a rehabilitation facility. Tanaka wept as medics lifted his stretcher, not from pain but from confusion and shame. He had been prepared to die as a warrior, to resist his captors, to maintain the fighting spirit that military indoctrination had instilled. But the Americans had made resistance impossible through kindness. They had saved his life when he had expected execution. They had treated him with a humanity that violated everything he had been taught about enemy cruelty and Western barbarism. The cognitive dissonance had shattered his ideological certainty, leaving him adrift in a moral framework he no longer understood. Yamamoto recognized Tanaka's confusion because he shared it. Every aspect of American prisoner treatment contradicted the lessons that had structured his understanding of warfare and human nature. The clean facilities, the abundant medical supplies, the professional care, the absence of deliberate cruelty, all suggested that the stories he'd been told about American savagery were lies, and if those stories were lies, then perhaps everything else was suspect as well. The symbolic object that came to represent this ideological collision was the medical kit, specifically the standard American first aid pouch that medics carried. These olive green canvas bags contained bandages, sulfur powder, morphine syrettes, antiseptic, and other supplies sufficient to provide immediate trauma care. American soldiers carried these kits as standard equipment, and medics carried larger versions with comprehensive surgical supplies. The kits embodied a philosophy that every life had value, that medical care was a right rather than a privilege, that even in warfare healing remained as important as harming. Japanese military medical supplies had been far more limited. Soldiers carried minimal first aid equipment, a few bandages, perhaps some disinfectant. Medical care was centralized in field hospitals that were often overwhelmed and undersupplied. The doctrine emphasized stoicism and self-sacrifice. Wounded soldiers were expected to endure pain without complaint, and those too severely injured to return to combat were often effectively abandoned. The concept of providing comprehensive medical care to enemy prisoners would have been dismissed as wasteful misallocation of resources needed for Japanese fighting men. Yet here were American medics treating Japanese prisoners with supplies that seemed inexhaustible. Yamamoto watched them work through the morning, each medic moving from patient to patient with practiced efficiency. They cleaned wounds that had been neglected for weeks, administered antibiotics to fight infections, distributed vitamins to combat nutritional deficiencies. They worked without apparent anger or resentment, their demeanour suggesting professional obligation rather than heroic charity. This was simply what they did, how they had been trained to operate, the standard of care their system expected them to provide. The facilities being established in Sugamo reflected similar principles. American engineers installed latrines that met sanitation standards, established water purification systems to provide safe drinking water, created ventilation in barracks to prevent disease transmission. They fumigated buildings to eliminate lice and other vermin, distributed clean clothing to replace contaminated garments, organised bathing facilities where prisoners could maintain basic hygiene. These were not luxuries but baseline standards, the minimum acceptable conditions for human habitation, as defined by American military doctrine. The contrast with Japanese prisoner camps could not have been starker. Yamamoto had read reports from inspectors who had visited facilities holding Allied prisoners, documents that described conditions so squalid that disease was inevitable, rations so inadequate that starvation was systematic, medical care so minimal that even treatable conditions became fatal. Those reports had been filed as routine administrative documents, noting problems but expressing no urgency about solutions. The suffering was unremarkable, barely worth documenting except as evidence that prisoners were being managed efficiently through minimal resource allocation. Now Yamamoto was watching an alternative model in practice. The Americans allocated substantial resources to prisoner welfare, not from abundance so great that waste didn't matter, but from conviction that proper treatment was morally and legally required. They had transported medical supplies across the Pacific specifically for treating enemy prisoners and civilians. They had assigned significant personnel to humanitarian missions rather than exclusively military operations. They treated prisoner welfare as strategic priority rather than administrative afterthought. The transformation in Yamamoto's understanding occurred through accumulated observation rather than sudden revelation. Each interaction he witnessed between American medical personnel and Japanese prisoners added evidence that his ideological framework was fundamentally wrong. The Americans were not cruel despite having every reason for vengeance. They were not indifferent to suffering despite owing nothing to their former enemies. They were providing care that exceeded minimal obligation, functioning according to principles that assumed human dignity transcended national identity or military status. One incident particularly destabilized his certainties. A Japanese prisoner became violent during medical examination, attacking a corpsman who had been checking him for disease. The man was restrained quickly by military police, but Yamamoto expected to see retribution. A beating, confinement in punishment cells, withdrawal of medical privileges. Instead, the medical officer ordered a psychiatric evaluation, determined that the prisoner was suffering from what would later be termed combat trauma, and recommended treatment rather than punishment. The prisoner was sedated, given appropriate medication, and scheduled for continued psychiatric care. The response made no sense within Yamamoto's moral framework. Violence against captors should have brought severe punishment. This was both just and necessary to maintain order. Instead, the Americans had interpreted the attack as symptom of illness requiring treatment rather than crime requiring punishment. They had extended understanding and medical care to someone who had just demonstrated hostility and danger. The entire interaction suggested that American military culture operated on principles radically different from those that had structured Japanese military behavior. The food provided to prisoners offered another point of contrast. American rations for Japanese prisoners were calculated to provide adequate nutrition for gradual recovery from malnutrition without shocking systems adapted to starvation. The meals included protein, carbohydrates, vegetables, and supplementary vitamins, balanced nutrition designed by dietitians consulting medical research. Prisoners received 3 meals daily, served in portions that increased gradually as their bodies adapted to adequate food intake. Yamamoto had seen the rations provided in Japanese prisoner camps, rice in quantities insufficient to sustain basic metabolism, occasionally supplemented by vegetables or fish of questionable quality. Men had starved slowly on those rations, their bodies consuming themselves while they performed forced labour. The starvation had been policy, not accident. Rations were deliberately calculated to provide minimal sustenance while maximising work output from prisoners whose survival was considered unimportant. The American approach suggested fundamentally different assumptions about the relationship between captors and captives. Japanese doctrine had treated prisoners as deserving only whatever their captors chose to provide, with no external standard constraining that choice. American doctrine operated within framework of international law and military ethics that established minimum standards independent of captor preference. Prisoners had rights that even victorious enemies were obligated to respect. These rights were codified in the Geneva Conventions, which Japan had signed but refused to ratify or implement. The conventions established specific requirements for prisoner treatment: adequate food and shelter, medical care, protection from violence, ability to communicate with families, limitations on forced labour. The standards reflected principles that prisoners retained human dignity despite military defeat, that certain treatment constituted war crimes regardless of enemy behaviour, that civilized nations accepted constraints on their conduct even toward those who had violated similar constraints. Yamamoto had been taught that such restrictions were weakness, evidence of Western decadence that would prove fatal in total war. Nations that constrained themselves through legal niceties would be defeated by those willing to use all available means without sentimental limitation. But Japan had been defeated decisively despite, or perhaps because of, its refusal to accept constraints. The Americans had won while fighting according to rules that Japanese military culture had dismissed as irrelevant. The medical personnel Yamamoto observed seemed to embody values that transcended military utility. They treated patients with courtesy that acknowledged personhood beyond military status. They explained procedures in careful Japanese, ensuring informed consent even when language barriers made communication difficult. They maintained detailed medical records documenting each prisoner's condition and treatment, creating accountability and enabling continuity of care. They operated according to professional standards that would have applied regardless of whether their patients were allies, enemies, or civilians. This professionalism reflected training that emphasized medical ethics alongside technical skills. American military medical personnel were taught that their primary obligation was to patients regardless of nationality or military status. The Hippocratic tradition, first, do no harm, was integrated into military medicine in ways that created genuine constraints on behaviour. Medics and doctors had refused orders that would have compromised patient welfare, had advocated for improved prisoner conditions, had treated even enemy wounded with the same care they provided to American casualties. Such behaviour seemed almost incomprehensible within Japanese military culture, where hierarchical obedience was absolute and personal conscience provided no legitimate basis for refusing orders. Medical personnel in Japanese military service had participated in, or acquiesced to practices that violated fundamental medical ethics: experimentation on prisoners, withholding treatment from enemy wounded, actively hastening death of those deemed unrecoverable. These violations had not resulted from individual sadism, but from systematic subordination of medical ethics to military imperatives. The Americans had maintained ethical boundaries even during total war. Their medical personnel had treated enemy wounded and prisoners according to professional standards, had advocated for humane conditions, had documented abuses when they occurred. This maintenance of ethical constraints had not weakened American military effectiveness, but had arguably strengthened it by reinforcing the moral framework that sustained public support for the war effort and facilitated post-conflict reconstruction. Yamamoto spent weeks processing prisoners through Sugamo, as the American occupation established comprehensive systems for managing former Japanese military personnel. He watched thousands of men receive medical screenings, nutritional rehabilitation, and treatment for diseases ranging from malaria to tuberculosis. He observed American personnel working with dedication that seemed motivated by professional obligation rather than personal sentiment. They were neither cruel nor sentimental, merely competent, executing procedures designed to restore health efficiently and humanely. The clean facilities became another symbol of the ideological divide. American engineers had transformed buildings that had been deliberately maintained in squalid condition into spaces that met basic sanitation standards. They installed windows that provided ventilation and natural light, repaired plumbing to provide running water, established waste disposal systems that prevented contamination. The physical transformation mirrored the philosophical transformation from viewing prisoners as subhuman to treating them as human beings deserving basic dignity. Japanese prisoner camps in territories occupied during the war had been characterized by deliberate neglect of sanitation. Buildings were overcrowded beyond capacity, ventilation was inadequate, water supplies were contaminated, waste disposal was primitive or non-existent. These conditions guaranteed disease transmission and high mortality. But the conditions were not accidental. They reflected policy decisions based on ideology that enemy prisoners deserved only minimal resources and that their suffering was consequence of their dishonorable surrender. The American standards applied to prisoner facilities demonstrated different priorities. Clean facilities were not luxury but requirement, grounded in military regulations and international law. The standards reflected understanding that disease control benefited everyone. Epidemic among prisoners could spread to guard forces and civilian populations, but they also reflected commitment to human dignity that transcended narrow utilitarian calculation. People deserved clean water and basic sanitation simply because they were people, regardless of military status or national origin. This principle extended throughout American occupation policy. Medical teams treated Japanese civilians alongside military prisoners, established public health programs to prevent epidemic disease, distributed food to address widespread malnutrition. The occupation was being conducted according to doctrines that distinguished between Japanese military leadership responsible for the war and Japanese population that had suffered under that leadership. The goal was not vengeance but reconstruction, transforming Japan into a stable democracy that would not threaten regional peace. Yamamoto gradually understood that the medical care and clean facilities he observed were not aberrations but expressions of fundamental values that structured American society and military culture. The abundance of medical supplies reflected industrial capacity and prioritization of healthcare. The professionalism of medical personnel reflected training systems that emphasized ethics alongside technical skills. The clean facilities reflected standards that assumed human dignity was non-negotiable even in warfare. These values had their origins in political philosophy that emphasized individual rights, democratic governance, and rule of law. American political culture was grounded in Enlightenment principles that humans possessed inherent dignity and rights that existed independent of state authority. Government legitimacy derived from consent of the governed and was constrained by constitutional limits. Legal systems established standards that bound even those in power. Medical ethics reflected these broader commitments to human dignity and professional autonomy. Japanese political culture during the militarist period had been structured very differently. Individual rights were subordinate to state interests. Authority flowed from emperor through rigid hierarchy to subjects obligated to absolute obedience. Legal constraints on state power were minimal or non-existent. Professional autonomy was limited by obligations to authority that transcended any independent ethical framework. The result was a system where atrocities could occur not despite but because of the values that structured political and military culture. The war's outcome had demonstrated the practical superiority of democratic systems in mobilizing resources and maintaining public support through extended conflict. But for Yamamoto, the more profound lesson came through observing how democratic values shaped behavior toward the defeated. The Americans could have treated Japanese prisoners with cruelty that would have been understandable given Japanese treatment of Allied prisoners. Instead, they maintained standards that reflected their stated values, demonstrating that those values were genuine rather than propaganda. The medical kit that Yamamoto eventually received, his own first aid pouch provided as part of processing former military personnel, became a physical reminder of these lessons. The olive green canvas bag contained supplies sufficient for immediate trauma care, bandages, antiseptic, pain medication. It was given to him not as prisoner but as human being who might need medical assistance provided by an occupying power that apparently felt obligation to ensure even former enemies had access to basic medical supplies. He kept the kit for decades after the war, the canvas fading but the contents largely unused. It sat in a drawer in his small Tokyo apartment, occasionally removed and examined as a reminder of the moment when his ideological certainty had collapsed. The kit represented the gulf between the military culture he had served and the one that had defeated it, between systems that valued life differently, that defined honor and obligation through opposed principles, that treated human dignity as either absolute or conditional. The years following the war brought fuller understanding of the crimes Japanese military forces had committed throughout Asia. Yamamoto learned the details that had been hidden or sanitized in wartime, the scale of atrocities in China, the death rates in prisoner camps, the systematic brutality that had characterized Japanese occupation. He learned about Unit 731's biological warfare experiments on living subjects, about the Bataan Death March, where thousands died from deliberate cruelty, about the countless smaller incidents where Japanese forces had treated conquered populations with systematic inhumanity. This knowledge brought shame that no amount of time could fully diminish. Yamamoto had not personally participated in atrocities, but he had been part of the system that committed them, had believed the ideology that justified them, had accepted without question the doctrines that made them possible. His experience observing American prisoner treatment had begun his moral education, forcing recognition that the values he had accepted were fundamentally wrong. But understanding the full extent of what those values had enabled brought a burden of historical guilt that shaped the remainder of his life. He became, in post-war Japan, an advocate for human rights and international law. He wrote about his experiences, describing the contrast between what he had expected and what he had witnessed when American forces occupied Tokyo. He emphasized particularly the medical care and facility conditions, using those details to illustrate larger points about the relationship between political values and military conduct. He argued that Japan's post-war democratic transformation was necessary not just for political stability, but for moral reconstruction, building society on principles that could not justify the crimes committed in the earlier era. His advocacy was motivated partly by remorse, but also by recognition that the Americans had demonstrated genuine alternative. Democratic values were not merely propaganda or hypocrisy. They could actually structure behavior in ways that maintained human dignity even in warfare. Medical ethics could constrain conduct even toward enemies. International law could establish standards that nations would follow even when violations would go unpunished. These possibilities had seemed naive abstractions before the war. The occupation had revealed them as practical realities that could survive contact with power. The clean facilities and medical care provided to Japanese prisoners were, Yamamoto came to understand, expressions of strength rather than weakness. Nations confident in their values could afford to treat enemies humanely, because that treatment reinforced the principles they were fighting to defend. The United States had waged total war while maintaining ethical constraints, not because those constraints were costless, but because maintaining them was understood as essential to the war's moral meaning. Victory over fascism would have been hollow if achieved through adopting fascist methods. This insight had implications extending far beyond prisoner treatment. It suggested that political systems grounded in human dignity and rule of law possessed advantages in mobilizing support, maintaining legitimacy, and sustaining effort through extended conflict. Democratic societies could fight total wars without becoming totalitarian, because their fundamental values provided constraints that even wartime emergency could not fully override. The constraints were not weaknesses to be exploited, but sources of strength that gave democratic warfare moral meaning that transcended mere power competition. The decades following the war demonstrated these principles in practice. Japan rebuilt as democracy with constitutional protections for human rights, legal constraints on governmental power, and civil society independent of state control. The transformation was imposed initially by occupation, but sustained by Japanese recognition that alternative models had led to catastrophic failure. The post-war democratic system was not perfect, but it established a framework where atrocities like those committed during the militarist era became institutionally difficult and culturally unthinkable. Yamamoto lived to see Japan become prosperous, democratic, and peaceful. Transformations so complete it seemed almost miraculous to someone who had witnessed the war's ending. The medical kit he kept in his drawer became artifact from another era, reminder of the moment when he'd begun to understand that his understanding had been profoundly wrong. The clean bandages and unused morphine syrettes represented alternative path, model of conduct grounded in principles that valued healing over harming. that maintained human dignity even toward enemies, that understood strength as including restraint. In his final years, Yamamoto would sometimes visit the site where Sugamo Prison had stood, now replaced by a shopping complex in Tokyo's urban sprawl. He would stand on the plaza where he had once watched American medics carry Japanese prisoners to medical facilities, trying to reconcile the prosperous present with the desperate past. The transformation seemed almost unbelievable. From defeated empire to prosperous democracy, from militarist dictatorship to stable constitutional government, from society that had committed atrocities to one committed to human rights. But the transformation had been real, enabled partly by Americans who had treated defeated enemies with humanity rather than vengeance. The medical care and clean facilities had been small acts within larger occupation policy, but they had demonstrated that democratic values were genuine, applicable even to those who had rejected and violated them. That demonstration had created space for genuine reconstruction, allowing defeated nation to rebuild on foundation of values it had previously despised, but came to recognize as superior to those that had led to catastrophic failure. The medical kit represented ultimately the difference between societies structured around opposed principles, one that valued individual dignity, constrained power through law, and maintained ethical standards even in warfare, and one that had subordinated individual worth to state power, rejected legal constraints as weakness, and treated ethics as subordinate to military necessity. The war had been contest between these opposed systems, and the outcome had vindicated the principles that many had dismissed as naive or weak. Yamamoto's experience observing American prisoner treatment had not been unique. Thousands of Japanese military personnel had similar experiences that challenged their ideological assumptions. But many had difficulty acknowledging what those experiences revealed, clinging to nationalist narratives that explain defeat through circumstance rather than fundamental systemic inadequacy. Yamamoto chose different path, accepting the psychological discomfort of recognizing he had been profoundly wrong about matters he had considered settled truth. That recognition brought no comfort, but did bring clarity. The Americans had shocked their Japanese prisoners not through cruelty, but through humanity, not through vengeance, but through systematic care, not through reducing enemies to subhuman status, but through maintaining standards that acknowledged dignity even in defeat. The shock had been educational, revealing through contrast how far Japanese military culture had departed from basic human decency, how completely ideology had corrupted judgment about appropriate conduct toward those rendered powerless. The clean facilities and medical care were symbols of democratic civilization at its finest, maintaining standards even when violations would have been understandable, treating enemies humanely because humanity required such treatment regardless of reciprocity, demonstrating through conduct that stated values were genuine rather than convenient propaganda. These acts of systematic kindness had been more devastating to Japanese ideology than any military defeat could have been, because they revealed that the stories about American barbarism were lies, while the reality of Japanese atrocities could no longer be denied. In the end, the greatest shock was not the facility's cleanliness or the medical supplies' abundance, but the simple fact that Americans treated Japanese prisoners as human beings deserving dignity and care. This treatment contradicted everything Yamamoto had been taught about warfare, enemies, and honor. It demonstrated that the militarist ideology that had structured his understanding was not just pragmatically unsuccessful, but morally bankrupt. And it revealed that democratic values, which Japanese propaganda had mocked as weakness, were actually sources of strength that could sustain societies through total war while maintaining their fundamental character. The medical kit sitting in his drawer represented all these lessons: the collapse of certainty, the education through contrast, the recognition that human dignity could and should transcend national identity, that healing could be more powerful than harming, that the true measure of civilization was how it treated those rendered powerless. These were lessons Yamamoto had learned through observation rather than instruction, through witnessing American conduct rather than reading American propaganda. They were lessons that shaped his remaining decades and his understanding of what the war had meant and why its outcome had been not just military victory but moral vindication.